Hello, YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's been a long while. Today I have my first real-time gouache tutorial that I'm super excited to share. You can follow along with this exactly as it is here, or you can just use it as a loose guide. It's totally up to you. I will list the brushes that I'm using today on screen, but I will also show you here. I have an old round brush, something that you don't care about ruining. I have two different sizes of round brushes. I have a flat wash brush, mostly just for applying water. About a medium-sized filbert, I'm not sure which size this is, but... And finally, a fine tip round brush, something with a very, very sharp point. I will also list the colors on screen for you, as I ended up adding a couple more that I didn't picture here. You'll also want some clean water, some rags, some paper towels, whatever you prefer. And just as a side note, I use my colors out of a palette, and you do not have to do this. This is just how I prefer to work. I'm going to start off by taping off my painting. This is something you definitely do not need to do. I just enjoy it, and it also gives me a means to create some other content. Next, I'm just going to apply a nice layer of water all over the paper. I will note it is very, very dry where I live, so I don't need to wait much time for my paper to absorb the water. I try and work as fast as I can. Next, I'm taking that turquoise blue and I'm getting a nice, really rich puddle of this color going. I also meant to mention I have the colors already on this palette because I did another one of these paintings just the other day before I filmed this, so they're already ready. But I'm taking that nice rich blue and getting a really, really thick coating on my paintbrush, and then I'm going to start from the top of the paper and slowly work my way down, trying to get as much coverage as I can with that darker blue. If you want a little more depth, you could even go with a slightly darker blue at the very top, but this is my favorite blue for a nice bright sky, so. Next, I'm going to be taking some of that sky blue, which is just kind of like a shade lighter, and I'm going to be applying it at the bottom of that previous blue, and then I'm going to be dragging it upwards into the other blue to try and get a nice blended gradient. You could use a bigger wash brush for this. I'm not really sure why I chose to do this with such a small filbert. Using a bigger brush would probably give you less streaks, but I didn't have too many problems with that this time. And finally, for the last part of our gradient of the sky, I'm going to take some fresh white. I always find fresh white works the best for skies. I'm going to take a little bit of that and just place it at the very bottom of our blues and just work it up just to soften that line a little bit. And the amount that you do any of these colors is totally up to your preference. You can do more white to give it more of a hazy effect, or you can do less. Next, I'm taking my my old ratty brush and I'm wetting it, and then I'm going to blot up some of that water, and where I want my clouds to be, I'm going to soak up some of the original paint we put down. This is a bit of a process for me, at least. I am constantly getting rid or washing the pigment off of my brush and rinsing it out in the water blotting it up, trying to soak up the paint, and just repeating the process over and over until I'm happy with the area. You can obviously place your clouds wherever you feel like it. You do not have to follow this to the T. You certainly can if you want to, but while I'm doing this on screen, I will note that clouds take a lot of practice to get a natural look, so don't feel bad if you can't get it the first time. Now I'm going to take my paper towel and just soak up just a little bit more of that pigment just to try and get the brightest white that I can. I probably would have been able to soak up a little bit more had I used a better paper, but this paper was a little iffy. Now I'm going to take the larger of my round brushes and get it nice and full of water, and I'm going to make a nice thick mixture of fresh white paint, and then I'm just going to blot that in where I want my clouds to be. The hope is you're doing this while the paper is still wet, so it gives it a nice soft fluffy effect. I tend to do mine with my paper just a little dry so it doesn't become too diffused. But we can also make it more defined when the paper is dry, which is typically what I do. So just for now, just kind of blocking in where you want the clouds to be. I will try and put on screen how I soften the bottom of the clouds. I take the bottom of, would that be the top or the bottom? Wherever the paint is not. And I try and press that against the paper to kind of feather out the bottom of the clouds. I'll try and again put an example of how I'm holding my brush to do that. Every time I'm going from cloud to cloud, I'm usually cleaning off my brush in the water and making sure that the brush is nice and clean so I'm not transferring any of that blue into the middle of the cloud. If you do that, it's not too big of a deal. You can probably fix it later. I just like to have a nice clean slate to start off with. So, if you get too many really fuzzy areas and you kind of want to clean them up, sometimes you'll get little veiny streaks of color. You can take your brush, a clean brush, and try and soften that out a little bit. The very top cloud of this painting kind of got a little too feathered for me, which we can also go in and fix once the paper is dry as well. Very small and very light circular motions are really good for just adding a little bit of detail to your clouds. I'll take that opportunity to say that when you're working with gouache, you probably want to really practice using a very light touch. Unless you're using something like acrylic gouache, your previous layers will reactivate, and having a very light touch kind of helps prevent that. Although in some circumstances, it's just kind of unavoidable. It's one of the unfortunate downfalls of gouache. Here I'm just taking a little bit more of that fresh white, and just as you work your way towards the horizon line, you kind of want to make those clouds appear smaller and smaller until they kind of just fade off into the distance. I'm just taking a bit more of that white here and just softening that line a little more. while we wait for our clouds to dry, we're going to go ahead and work on the sand at the bottom. My mixture for the sand is burnt umber with a tiny bit of that yellow ochre and then a bunch of white to try and soften it up a little bit. Now starting at the very bottom and then working our way up, I'm just going to do a bit of a soft gradient wherever you want the sand to be. You can put it however far up you'd like. I will say that on my previous painting, I put it much further up than I did on this one, and I think it really helped give the painting, or at least the ocean, a bit more depth. It made it really look like you could see the sand underneath the water. If I were to redo this one again, I'd probably bring that brown up a little more. And now I'm taking that really, really bright blue again. And I think at some point here, I grab my ruler before I start doing this. And I don't usually do this, but I did it this time for this video. Just gently marking out where you want your horizon to be, especially on paintings like this. If you get it off or crooked, it becomes very apparent when you step back. So I don't usually do this, but I will start doing it from now on because crooked horizons are not fun. So just mark that out if you want. You can even do that before you start your sky if you want. But so yeah, now I'm going in with that really, really bright blue and trying to follow that mark as closely as possible. We're just going to mark out our horizon line here with our nice bright blue. My paper was not wet at this point either, so if yours is not wet, you don't necessarily have to worry about that. If you want it to be wet, you can go ahead and re-wet it, but I think I got a just fine result not re-wetting at all. Once you get your horizon line to where you like it, you can go ahead and start dragging that blue down and blending it with that sand color. I personally really, really love the mix of those two colors together. I think it gives it a really, really rich, almost like tropical feel, making the water look really, really crystal clear and just a really nice effect, I think. It doesn't need to be perfect here either because we're going to be adding a lot of detail on top of it. However, you can blend it however much you want. I believe I'm going back in right now and adding a little bit more of the brown to blend it a little bit more. At this point, I have let my page dry completely. You can use a hairdryer to do this. I don't typically do that. I usually just find something else to go do while I'm waiting for it to dry. But make sure that your painting is dry before you move on to this next step. So now I'm going into that fresh white again, and I'm getting more paint than I would have last time. So you have a bit of, I don't want to say chunky paint, but you have a lot more paint on your brush than water. And we're going to go back in and add the nice highlights to the clouds. If you want to skip this step, you totally can if you want to keep them nice and soft and fluffy looking. I like my clouds to stand out a little more on their highlights, so I think it gives it just a really, really majestic, fun thunderhead feel. So now I'm just going in and marking off where I want those highlights to be. You kind of want to keep in mind where your light is coming from. Mine was coming from the left side of this painting, so I was just keeping those highlights to the left of the clouds. You can have yours be on the right, or you could have it come from slightly below or above, wherever you feel like putting it. Again, when I'm doing this, I'm taking the paint and placing it in those highlights, and then I'm kind of using the portion of the brush that doesn't have paint on it and just using very small circles to kind of blend it in with the other paint. Again, using a very, very light touch to do this. If you kind of scrub too hard here, you will end up picking up your lower layers of paint, which is not a fun problem to deal with in gouache. Those holes can be really hard to fill in again and tend to look a little unnatural if you pick them up again. So And if you do so, obviously do not feel bad. It's kind of it takes a lot of practice to get used to what is too much and what is too little with gouache. And obviously your clouds don't need to be perfect. Any texture, I think, adds a little bit more depth to the clouds. Again, clouds are very hard to get a natural look in, and it takes a lot of practice to kind of get an organic feel. They can very quickly become very cartoony looking, which I think mine are a little bit more stylized to the not so natural look. However, still trying to give them that natural organic look can be a little hard, so don't feel bad if you can't get it first try. I do have a little bit of advice. Using a flat or square tipped brush is somehow really, really nice for getting very random organic shapes to your clouds, so maybe give that a try sometime. I do believe this part of the video is fairly long. I'm basically just putting in the highlights and then using those tiny little circular motions to just blend out wherever I feel needs to be blended. So I will hop back in when I feel like I have something else to say. A quick note about blending wet gouache into already dried gouache. You want to make sure that your brush isn't too wet when you do that. If it's to the point where you're going to create a puddle of water, that puddle of water will reactivate your previous layers of gouache very quickly. So you probably want to have, I would say at most, a damp brush, not a soaking wet brush. That will create big holes in your painting that you don't want. Holes in the paint, not in your painting. So at this point in time, we'll move on from the clouds. If you need to pause the video and work on your clouds more, feel free to. If you need to skip ahead, feel free to do so. Next, we'll be working on the ocean. So right now, I'm just going back in and re-wetting the that really deep blue that we used for the sky and the ocean. And here is where I add just a little bit more of like a darker blue and a little bit of a darker green, just to give it a little bit of variation. And when I say a little, I mean like the tiniest little bit of those colors. And then I'm just going in and adding some not totally straight lines, some little wavy type lines to indicate a small crest of a wave. It's not going to be too extreme, it's going to be very gentle. And these certainly don't need to be perfect. I would say to try and keep them parallel, as that helps emphasize the effect of the ripples and the waves. But feel free to make them, you know, as wavy as you want. Okay, we're jumping around a little bit here. I'm going to add the texture to the sand right now, and I forgot to mention that a toothbrush will come in very handy for this. Just an old toothbrush, and we're just going to dip it into the paint here, and then you can use a piece of paper. You don't have to use your hand. But we're just going to splatter the sand in some varying shades of brown to kind of give it that speckly and sandy effect. For this part, I'm mostly just using the burnt umber with varying amounts of white. You probably don't want to go too dark. I mean, or maybe you do. Who's to say? But just giving it lots of variation to really give it kind of more of a stylized, sparkly effect, or a textured effect, if you will. And once again, you don't have to use your hand here. Feel free to use a piece of paper or something that's tall enough to cover the rest of the painting. You do not have to use your hand, and you don't have to get all dirty like I do. Just a quick note here about the texture that you get from your toothbrush. If you'd like bigger droplets that transfer to your paper, you're going to want more water added to your paint. If you want a finer mist-like spray, you'll want to use more paint and have a thicker mixture. Here I'm just going back in with that very fine tip round brush, and I'm taking a bit of the highlight color and accenting a few spots by hand rather than doing it with the toothbrush. Jumping around yet again, I'm going back in with that more medium-sized round brush, and I'm going back in with the shadow color for the waves, and I'm just adding more detail and more lines with the shadow color. Next, I'm going in with our second blue color that we used for the sky, and I'm taking it into the ocean, and I'm going to start building up the highlights for the waves. I'm using the same method here, placing random sort of wavy horizontal lines, starting smaller in the distance and working them larger as they work towards the viewpoint. As the waves gradually get closer to the viewpoint, I do start to incorporate a bit more of an S type shape where the horizontal lines kind of connect together in that snaking fashion. This really helps create the illusion of the water sort of gliding over the sand. Here I'm just taking a little bit of extra white and blending out some of the sand color that ran a little bit amiss. Continuing to build up the highlights on the waves, I'm now going in with the lightest blue color that I use for this painting. This is that Mysotis blue. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it's kind of like a cornflower blue, very powdery blue. You certainly don't need to use this particular color. Any blue mixed with white will do just fine. In addition to building up the highlights on the waves in the distance, I am also using this blue to build up where I'd like the foam to be, the foam that's sort of lapping up onto the beach. And to do this, I'm just using a very small stippling or dotting motion to kind of give it that nice foamy bubbly effect. This color will also serve as a bit of a shadow to the bubbles that we create later. A helpful hint that I wanted to include here is that if you're using a fine tip brush like this to add fine details or sort of these very fine lines in the distance, if you use a twisting motion in your paint to roll your paintbrush, sort of as if you're using a pencil sharpener, it will help you get that nice fine point on your paintbrush and help those lines be nice and crisp. Once again, I'm going in with my shadow color and just kind of carving out some space in between the highlights that have already been placed. Some of them tend to get a little too bold for my liking, so I just take the shadow color and trim them down a little bit. At this point, I do believe I stepped away again to let my painting dry completely. This way we can start adding the white on top of the highlights we've already built up. This will help prevent any mixing of the blue to the white and help provide that nice crisp highlight that we're going for. As with the highlights on the clouds, I do recommend going with some fresh white here, as white that has been put into a palette always seems to become a little bit more transparent and not quite as bright as you'd like those highlights to be. So going in with that fresh white again, I'm just repeating the process over again and sort of building up on top of the highlights that are already placed and just giving them just that little bit more of the sparkle. Using that same stippling motion, I'm going to take lots of thick white paint and just start building up those little rolls of foam that are working their way up onto the sand. What I think is one of the most important tricks to making this water look super sparkly is taking your white paint and your white highlights, and where they sort of trail off at the ends, do a little bit of a dotting effect that kind of gradually fades out. This helps give it that really, really sparkly effect. I also use a variation of this technique in the middle of the waves where the highlight is the boldest. I put some larger dots to represent some larger sparkles in the middle of that wave to help really highlight it. Here I switched back over to my non-fine point round brush to help in the process of making some of the foam. Using the really fine point takes a really long time to build up all the dots and the details of the foam, so using a slightly bigger brush can help the process go a little quicker. And once again, as the waves start to move closer to the viewpoint, the sparkles and the details of the waves will start to get a little larger, so implementing those larger dots kind of helps give the illusion that they are closer to the viewer. This is probably going to be the longest portion of the video, as I tend to spend a lot of time building up these small highlights and sparkles, so feel free to follow along exactly as it is here, or if you don't want to add this many sparkles, feel free to skip forward and see what we do when we're done with them. Next, I'm switching over to this very small, tiny point round brush. I mentioned this on the overlay at the beginning of the video, but I didn't think I was going to use it, so I didn't show it. But this is just seriously the finest point paintbrush you can find. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of that fresh white again, and on the biggest highlights in your ocean, we're going to add vertical perpendicular lines. This is the trick, I think, to making the ocean look super stylized and sparkly. It gives you those sort of light flares, really adding to that effect. A little bit of advice when using this technique, you kind of want to avoid having too many lines that are both going up and down. Almost like a star, I tend to save those for the biggest highlights. The effect that I think works really well is sort of placing them randomly. So let's say you'll have two going up and then one down and then one up and two down. You kind of just want to save your biggest flares for your biggest highlights. Hopefully I'm doing an okay job at explaining that and that you can see this as I'm painting it. I feel like this is very hard to explain. Once you're happy with adding all of the little highlights and sparkles and light flares, we're going to move on to adding just a hint of shadow to the foam that's up on the beach. This gives it that nice roll effect and helps it not look so flat. The color that I'm using to do this is that light powdery blue, the highlight color that we used before we added the white. And once again, I'm just using that small dotting motion at the right side of the foam. Whichever direction your light is coming from, you'll want to put the shadows on the opposite side of the foam. Next, I'm just taking a little bit of that fresh white and carving a bit more highlight into the shadows that I've placed. Moving on, I'm going to put a little bit of a shadow underneath the foam. To do this, I'm going to add a little bit of burnt umber to our original sand color, and just at the very base of the foam, put a fine line of that brown, and where your foam is at its thickest, consider giving it a little bit of a bolder shadow. This really helps give your painting a little bit more depth and helps with that little bit of illusion of detail. Here I'm going back in with just a slightly damp brush and just feathering out the edge on the shadow to help it not look so harsh. Next, I'm taking just a little bit of the sand highlight color, and where the shadow meets the normal color for the sand, I'm going to place just a tiny line to indicate just a hint of reflection of the foam. This again adds a little bit of detail and adds a little bit of something to your painting. To finish off, I'm taking a bit more of that sand highlight color and just adding some dots by hand to accent what was done by the toothbrush. This again is optional, you don't have to do this, I just like to do it. And with that, we are done. Here's a little tape peel for you. I had to speed it up because this paper was very fragile and the tape was threatening to rip it. But if you made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back. I'm sure your painting turned out wonderfully. If you'd like to share it with me, feel free to tag me on Instagram. I would love to see it. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. It would be most appreciated. I hope you enjoyed yourselves today, and until next time, take care of yourselves and have a good day.